I don't have a favourite of any of my films, but I think that The Dark Knight Rises is an underrated movie.
One of filmmaking's most elusive bounties is the perfect movie trilogy. I mean, think about it. It's hard enough to get one film made, and much harder to make one film brilliant. It's almost implausible then to repeat that success 2 more times back to back. There are so many instances of the magic happening twice, of lightning being somehow recaptured with the second entry, only for the third to fall apart. The second sequel curse, as it were. There have been a lot of trilogies made over the course of cinema's decades, but how many can truly claim to be a perfect trifecta? The Human Condition, the Before trilogy, the Star Wars trilogy, Indiana Jones, The Lord of the Rings, right through to the greatest of them all, in my opinion.
There are no good third sequels, basically. Rocky 3, maybe, but they are very difficult.
Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy. From a narrative, structural, thematic, and filmmaking perspective, these 3 films are individual masterpieces, but when combined, create something that is even richer than the sum of its parts. Batman Begins crafted an exemplary origin story, introducing us to all facets of Bruce Wayne and morphing him into the Batman, with a mixture of believability and, well, just sheer fucking awesomeness. The Dark Knight escalated things both from a storytelling standpoint, guided by Heath Ledger's immortal antagonist in The Joker, and from a filmmaking perspective, with every last frame poured over to create a cinematic ballet of unprecedented brilliance, especially relative to the superhero genre.
My instinct was to change genres. The first one is an origin story, the second one is a crime drama, very much like Heat.
Now, you probably know where I'm going with this. Yeah, I adore these movies. I was lucky enough to be there when Batman Begins happened, and you know I lined up on opening night for The Dark Knight. And when the credits rolled on that middle entry, I thought, that can't be topped. There's no fucking way. It's not possible. Nolan can't do that. And it appears that even Christopher Nolan himself felt the same way. 4 years passed, and what could have been a trilogy appeared to be truncated.
And the third one we needed to blow up bigger, because you can't scale down. The audience doesn't give you any choice, but nor can you go back and do what you've done before. So you've got to shift genres. We'd made 2 films, and everybody's made all these films about this awful thing is going to happen, but we needed to go there. All of these films have threatened to turn Gotham inside out and collapse it in on itself. Let's just go there and have the horrible thing happen.
And so Nolan gave the third film a shot anyway. The story jumped forward 8 years. Bruce Wayne was reduced to a Howard Hughes-esque broken, injured shell of a man compared to the epitome of fitness we saw in The Dark Knight. And Nolan crafted The Dark Knight Rises, a film that not only defied the curse of the second sequel, not only stands as one of the great final films in a trilogy, but might just be the greatest Batman film. Yep, you heard it, I'm going there, folks. Better than this one or even that one. Now hold on, before you set your monitor on fire out of disgust, hear me out. But also, don't just take my word for it. In the words of Nolan himself, The Dark Knight Rises is an underrated movie. And for me, it carries so much sentimental value. This trilogy defined my upbringing, my love of cinema, and my love of Christopher Nolan. And so while many of you might disagree with me, this is a film that holds a special place in my heart, and I have no words other than it's f***ing perfect. And I'm gonna explore why. So I'm about to glide you through why The Dark Knight Rises is essential Bat cinema, so much so that you're probably going to want to watch the entirety of Nolan's trilogy again. The problem? These 3 films have been scattered across the grimy urban wastes of streaming services. Did you know that Batman Begins and The Dark Knight are on Netflix waiting for you, but that The Dark Knight Rises has been stashed away separately on HBO Max? Thankfully, Likewise TV is here to gather up all 3 movies and make the darkness your ally. Likewise is a hub that connects all of your streaming services to one location, meaning you don't have to keep track of what's streaming where and can spend more time actually streaming. On top of that, Likewise's Spotlight feature will keep you up to date on what's freshly arrived so that you can be the first to sink your teeth into the next Squid Game instead of the last. And it'll remind you when something's about to leave so that you don't miss out. So come follow me at likewisetv.com and you can search at FilmSpeak and you can check out some of the lists I have of the best trilogy finales and best movie endings. Spoiler alert, The Dark Knight Rises is on both of those lists, and try Likewise out for yourself for a better, easier experience with streaming. And thank you so much to Likewise for sponsoring this video. Like The Dark Knight before it, The Dark Knight Rises does what any great sequel must: make the previous film better, even if that previous film already seems like it can't be any better. Nolan was absolutely right in the reasoning behind his hesitation to make a third film. It can't be unnecessary, and if it's not directly enriching the story told by the previous entries, well, why make the movie in the first place? Narratively, this film is a sequel to The Dark Knight, but thematically, it's more a sequel to Batman Begins. By being beholden to both of the previous entries rather than just the immediate preceding one, The Dark Knight Rises feels like a much more involved and essential entry. In turn, the trilogy as a whole feels more well-rounded, more complete, more rewarding for those who watch it in sequence. The natural inclination for a writer is that you want to follow up the previous film, you want to take your characters directly forward, keep the story moving directly forward. But there's a voice in the back of your head that is also saying, circle back around to the beginning. Letting that voice have just enough influence to build on the themes of Batman Begins without disregarding the narrative of The Dark Knight requires both confidence and meticulous command of one's craft. The Dark Knight Rises presents itself as a deeply fascinating examination of Batman, in part because it's an examination and deconstruction of the previous two entries. In particular, a lot of the ideas present in The Dark Knight are deliberately flipped on their head here. The notion explored in The Dark Knight that Batman's very presence and actions in Gotham are part of what fuels crime itself is reinforced here, with crime seemingly at an all-time low following the passage of the Dent Act in Batman's absence. But in reinforcing that, it also challenges the notion that Batman is the hero Gotham deserves. Maybe Gotham neither deserves nor needs Batman at all. And even though Batman goes on to save the city from Bane, the ending reinforces this idea. Batman is revered as a hero, and the image of him stands for justice and victory, but the Dark Knight himself is gone forever, and Gotham seems to be better off for it. As things stand at the start of the film, if Batman were to be considered a test or experiment, most people would probably label Batman an abject failure. The Dark Knight Rises itself is a movie about failure. More specifically, it's a movie about what happens when Batman fails. Batman and Gordon failed at the end of The Dark Knight. They quote-unquote won in the sense that they defeated Joker and Dent, but it was such a hollow victory, maybe even a Pyrrhic one. Batman is forced to go into hiding as a murderer that he, Gordon, and the audience all know he isn't, because the alternative, unmasking Dent, could be the destruction of Gotham City. He has spent so long building himself back up, hiding the deterioration of his body, and then gets his ass kicked by Bane because he's not being authentic. He's just putting on the cape and cowl and going through the motions because it's what Gotham needs him to do. He's not passionate, he's not driven about the matter. He thinks that he can go in there and be the same old Batman that he was at the end of The Dark Knight, but Bane makes it pretty clear that he can't. That being said, The Dark Knight Rises is also a film about hope, but maybe not in the sense that you would expect. Rather, it's about the way that hope can be weaponized. Dent's memory inspires hope and leads to reform, but it's also used as a way to directly combat crime. The Dent Act is almost a militarization of Gotham's police force, and while it's effective in quashing crime in the city, it's also a manipulation of what Dent stood for. If hope requires a police state in order to be achieved, then the entire system is fundamentally broken. It allows hope to be turned into terror. Hope is what leads to what is perceived as positive change initially, but Bane also comes along and uses that same hope to terrorize the people of Gotham. Just like with Bruce in the Pit, Bane makes it seem like the people of Gotham have control over their own destiny, that they can escape whenever they want. This motivates them to keep trying. There's the hope which makes the defeat more crushing. Then there's Catwoman, who's more jaded against the whole thing to begin with. In this trilogy, even Batman is sort of the inverse of hope. He doesn't really become the hero until The Dark Knight Rises. Blake talks about this, about how all the other orphan kids look up to Bruce Wayne, who Blake knows to be Batman, and how even some cops talk about him as this mythic figure of hope. Despite all of the cynicism expressed by some of the characters or even the story, the film itself never comes down on hope as being foolish. It can be misused and abused, but in the end, hope is very valuable. Catwoman is inspired to stick around despite her natural inclination to not be optimistic and hopeful, and Batman triumphs. While hope is a weapon, it's also what drives him, and ultimately what he tries to give to Gotham. Wayne Enterprises' nuclear reactor also signifies hope, one directed towards, as Talia says, a more sustainable future, and it's a hope that is literally weaponized to be a bomb. Blake also has this great moment where he tells the kids to get back on the bus and yells at the priest to not let them die without hope. He's doing the same thing as Bane almost, but Blake is using hope to protect people from something out of their control. This hope almost becomes a type of faith, which is why Blake interacts with a priest despite not being religious. Even Alfred generates hope via the noble lie, which is established in the last film. Better to let them believe in something that isn't true rather than to crush them with the truth. Better to know Rachel wasn't going to move on because it doesn't do anything to Bruce but crush him. Same with Harvey. No point in letting all the good work he did go to waste because of what he became in his final days. The Dark Knight Rises takes those ideas and then says, okay, yeah, but it's still a lie. It's still corrosive. For all the good you intended to achieve, it has unintended consequences. It crushes Bruce to know that he couldn't have been with Rachel. Same as how the Dent Act creates a false sense of security that Bane can exploit, come and tear up without questioning its legitimacy. Deep down, Gordon isn't at peace because he knows he's been lying for close to a decade. All of those inmates incarcerated at Blackgate, put there because of a lie. The justice system manipulated. It gives a corrupt police force carte blanche to abuse their power and fight for their blue-blooded brotherhood instead of preserving law and order and protecting the people of Gotham. Why do you think they let Bane go after the hit on the stock exchange? When Batman resurfaces, they want revenge on him for killing one of their own. It becomes the monkey's paw. Blake even questions the imprisonment of all those people in Blackgate based off of a lie. The film, for as much as it's about hope, is also about truth. The hope that Alfred, Gordon, and Batman are creating is all built on a lie. It's not real the same way Bane creates false hope with lies, and in the end, they have to embrace the truth and the fact that that's where real hope comes from, always. You see how someone can use manufactured hope to misdirect you. Hope, truth, rising, the big ideas of this trilogy of films, along with growing beyond your failures. There's this nice symmetry that Batman is telling a noble lie while being lied to by Alfred. And when he finds out the truth, it shatters a lot of the preconceived notions of what he was doing, because he and Gordon were doing the exact same thing to Gotham. It's important to the story that Bane and Alfred make things personal so he knows how it feels. Bruce gets a taste of his own medicine in this film. He's lied to, his back is broken. Hell, even Catwoman pulls his own disappearing trick on him. The Dark Knight Rises is the culmination of this idea throughout the trilogy of Batman being someone who always acts. He can't give up on the people of this city like the League of Shadows. In The Dark Knight, he has to break several of his rules in order to get the job done, including violating civil liberties. In The Dark Knight Rises, he faces the reprisals of those actions. Nonetheless, the film doesn't have a black and white view of the morality of Batman's actions. The film is aware of the nuance and gray area, particularly through Blake's point of view. His dialogues with Bruce make it clear that he neither entirely approves nor disapproves of Batman's actions. The film pretty firmly comes down on the fact that what they did was wrong, but also acknowledges that the intentions and even the results were simultaneously good. Additionally, failure doesn't mean you should give up. Why do we fall? So we learn to pick ourselves back up. Batman falls at the end of the previous film, and even though he did so with good intentions, taking down Dent, who had gone entirely off the deep end, the events of this movie challenge him to give up. For 8 years, he stops trying and gives into apathy, and it allows something far, far worse to fester as Bane engineers his scheme under the surface. At the same time, Batman's apathy allows his injured body to literally atrophy. Batman then faces a far greater struggle to pull himself out of the apathy, climb out of the hole, find that hope, and overcome a force that is there to just prey on that same apathy. Because this is something that is built for 8 years. It's a lot more difficult for him to do what he needs to do than if Bane had arrived the day after Harvey Dent's death. Talia and Bane are extensions of Ra's al Ghul, just like Bruce Wayne is. All three found themselves in a pit early in their lives, and their experiences in the pit defined their outlook. Talia was left for dead there by her father. Bane was torn apart by the people inside, and both aligned themselves with the monster inside the pit. Bruce was instead able to split himself from the monster and use it as a tool, not only to escape, but in his life afterwards as Batman, rather than as an ideology. The dichotomy of how these similar experiences shaped these different characters can even be outlined on a basic visual level. The image of Ra's coming down and raiding the well looks similar to the shot of Thomas coming down and saving Bruce from the well. Thomas is imbued by optimism. Ra's is the opposite. Thomas was a doctor who actually saved lives. Ra's is a warlord who thinks he's saving lives by taking them. He views people as growths to be cut away. He doesn't see individual people, he just sees large swathes. Rather than symptoms of the problem, Ra's sees them as the problem. He's not a doctor, he's trying to get rid of the symptom by eradicating the entire organism. And if Thomas is analogous to Raz, then it would make sense that Talia would be analogous to Bruce. They're both inspired by their words in some form. And then there's Bane. Bruce adopted the dark, but Bane was born in it, molded by it. Bane is the actual monster that Batman pretends to be, and whatever terrified Bruce in that well is literally what Talia found in the pit as a child. Talia and Bane, therefore, represent the exact opposite of Batman in that he is optimism personified. They are pessimism or cynicism. Batman never gives up, even if everything has failed. Talia and Bane believe in cutting your losses, even if that means nuking a city, and they don't believe in the inherent goodness of people where Batman does. They are a necessary evil for the story because these people have ruined Gotham, so they are inherently bad, and now we have to do a bad thing in order to right their wrong. Again, Batman refuses to give up on people. Batman fights for those little moments of humanity, which is why he remembers Gordon putting a coat over his shoulder to comfort him as a kid right before he goes off to sacrifice himself and save the city. Talia and Bane utterly lack such humanity. Ultimately, if Bane is what Batman is based on, then Talia is a reflection of Bruce Wayne. Even beyond the villains of the film, the authorities of Gotham serve as an impediment to Batman. There's a discussion to be had about how over-policed Gotham is, and the careless dispatch of the entire force to one location after Gordon is shot shows how uninterested in doing their actual jobs they are. They're completely self-interested, and revenge against a cop killer is the only thing that would divert their attention away from protecting the wealthy elite at the stock exchange. Recent events have made the image of Batman in the climax leading cops into battle tough, and an unfortunate thing. The film presents a scenario that feels like a fantasy 10 years later. Cops have to actually fight for the people instead of serving a master. But in this particular scenario, it's less the police being redeemed and this idea that Batman is rallying the people, the police, to do the right thing, do what it is they swore an oath to do. The first two films are so deeply skeptical of the system that the police exist within, so it can be jarring to see what almost seems like the opposite sentiment on the surface with The Dark Knight Rises. But the way Nolan was thinking about the film was more symbolically than literally. He's not really thinking about the police as a one-to-one representation of the police in our world. The police in the trilogy exist as an idea. They represent the institutions of Gotham City. They are the police because they're in a position to enforce and represent the power structures of Gotham City. Yeah, Batman teams up with the police, but it's the idea of Batman and the institutions of Gotham banding together that has an appeal. Not just Batman plus cops solves all your problems equals good, see you later. It's not quite as literal as it comes across, but the way the film talks about the police and the Dent Act make it clear that a lot of people take umbrage with both, despite their positive aspects. It's the same sort of thing with the Occupy Wall Street stuff.
The Occupy Wall Street movement was right there. We literally had to schedule around them. It was very clear to us at the time that the sympathies of the film were very in tune with the sympathies of that movement. If you want to talk about class in these films, you need to look at The Dark Knight Rises, because Bruce literally has to lose everything and become bankrupt before he can triumph.
Bane comes in and says things that are designed to inspire hope. He's saying stuff that's analogous to a movement that was trying to shake people out of apathy. It was very much intentional. Nolan wasn't trying to say Bane is just like the Occupy movement. He's using Bane as an example of those who will piggyback on sincerely good-intentioned movements in order to distort them and use them for one's own gain. Bane is using the sentiments of Occupy-like movements, ones that he doesn't in actuality care for, in order to wreak his own brand of havoc. Bane doesn't intend to have a valid point overall, he's just saying things that serve his ulterior motive. Bane's motivations aren't to fix Gotham, it's just to make people think he's going to fix it for long enough until it all literally blows up, which is ironically precisely what Bane thinks Batman is doing.
I've had as many conversations with people who have seen the film the other way around. We throw a lot of things against the wall to see if it sticks. We put a lot of interesting questions in the air, but that's simply a backdrop for the story. What we're really trying to do is show the cracks of society, show the conflicts that somebody would try to wedge open. We're going to get wildly different interpretations of what the film is supporting and not supporting, but it's not doing any of those things, it's telling a story. If you're saying, have you made a film that's supposed to be criticizing the Occupy Wall Street movement? Well, obviously that's not true.
Beyond that, there's more in what inspired this film than just Occupy. Some of the more revolutionary imagery comes from the French Revolution, particularly from A Tale of Two Cities. Because Nolan is using those broader symbols rather than ultra-specific details, you can apply them to the modern day. They're practically timeless. Bane is weaponizing hope. He could have just blown the city up immediately, but instead, he's subjecting Gotham to a form of torture while making them think they have a chance. He doesn't even need a scapegoat, he's just filling your head with these nice ideas to distract people from the fact that he's about to destroy a city.
Of all of my films, The Dark Knight Rises is the one that's been pushed and pulled in the weirdest number of directions. I think you have to go out of your way to look at the film and attribute it to right-wing characteristics. If anything, it's specifically left-wing. When people listen to Bane and say, he sounds like Donald Trump, or that Donald Trump sounds like him, well, it's about a demagogue. He's the bad guy. What was I afraid of when I wrote The Dark Knight Rises? I was afraid of demagoguery. Turns out I was right to be afraid. The film was not supposed to be political. It's not intended to be. It's about primal fears. At the time we were writing, there really was this sense of false calm. Everybody thinks everything's okay. We got through the financial crisis, but there are underlying things brewing that could lead to difficult places. By testing the structures, as the films get to do in a safe and cathartic environment, you're exploring in some ways the dangers of chaos and anarchy. With anarchy in particular, I think, as the prime antagonist of all three films. The idea of a vigilante standing between society and its collapse is a very uncomfortable one for me and for most people, but there's also a certain wish fulfillment to it. You want to believe in heroic figures who can individually tip the balance or inspire people in a particular way. That's the way in which these films were made.
It makes the point succinctly. Just because, for example, Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders might say similar-ish things, or might happen to independently make points that are in the same neighborhood as one another, doesn't make their ideologies the same. You can say the same is true about Bane and the Occupy movement. One makes their points with earnestness, and the other because they have an ulterior motive for eliciting that feeling. The film makes it abundantly clear that Bane is making some valid points, but ultimately, he's making them completely insincerely. It's honestly what makes Bane such a phenomenal villain. As Tom Schoen in the Nolan Variations puts it, in the comic books, Bane is a brute in a brightly colored wrestling mask. In Nolan's interpretation, he's a gas-masked revolutionary with the build of a bison and a Vaderish breathing muzzle that turns his oddly cultivated accent into a hideous rasp as he delivers long speeches urging the downtrodden citizens of Gotham to take back control of their city from their rich oppressors. When Bane places a GPS tracker in the jacket of one of his own men, shoots him, and shoves him into the sewer to track Jim Gordon's escape route, his actions perfectly express the film's brutal, neo-Orwellian black wit. The demagoguery is relevant and eerily prescient. Because Bane has such a public persona, he gets to be a real villain. He gets to be a public figure in the way we see public figures. It's cool to see Batman fight some of the villains we may have in our own world, that we do have in our own world. The brawn and the intelligence make him the first Batman villain who is a physical mirror to Batman. Batman is smart and a ninja. Bane is more of both. He's a super genius and he literally breaks Batman. He's everything Batman is physically, placing him therefore as this what might have been kind of version of Batman. The Batman that had stayed with the League of Shadows and fulfilled his mission, being an enforcer for this horrible death cult. As Tom Schoen in the Nolan variations puts it, we take Gotham from the corrupt and give it to you, the people. Bane coos with curling musicality as the rich are hauled before kangaroo courts. Nolan does to Gotham what he did to Leonard Shelby in Memento. He puts an entire city in solitary confinement. A Dr. Zhivago-like snowfall further isolates the city, marking the beginning of a long winter, which means that Bane's big climactic brawl with Batman, his blows as fast and furious as Tyson's, comes lightly dusted with snow, of the same kind that Bruce trudged through to get to the League of Shadows' monastery in the first film, which seems to flurry sideways as much as down. Even Nolan's snowflakes don't know which way is up. On top of all of that, Tom Hardy and the sound design, the costume design, everything about him is impeccable. He's very tempered, almost like an English gentleman trapped inside the Incredible Hulk. He's so poised and mannered and calm, even when he's threatening. It's what makes him terrifying before the brutality comes out, and then a nightmare once it finally does. The first we see of Bane, once he has arrived in Gotham, is his back, sitting crouched on his knees in the darkness of his lair in the city's underground sewer system. His muscles are thrown into relief by the overhead light, appearing sculpted against the surrounding darkness, like Brando's bald head in Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now. Hardy offsets and highlights Bane's brutality with similarly feline strokes of delicacy, the little finger twitch before a killing, the proprietorial hand he lays on the shoulder of Daggert before breaking his neck, or his appreciation for the voice of a boy singing the Star-Spangled Banner prior to a football game.
"That's a lovely, lovely voice,"
he remarks, before launching the citywide explosives attack that brings Gotham to its knees. Thus, does Hardy suggest that Bane is a civilized brute, or rather, civilization's brute, the unpaid debt civilization must pay for its heedlessness, risen to manhandle its finery? Every time Bane lashes out, it's measured. It's one of the most accurate representations of psychopathy in a cinematic villain. He's in control the whole time, and the only time he loses control is at the end when Batman breaks his mask, and then he only sees red, which is terrifying in its own right. Heath Ledger's Joker is a once-in-a-lifetime performance, and nothing will come close to topping that. He's also harder to ignore, and he's in the film more. But with Bane, there's a similar magnetism. He commands the scenes he's in. They're in the same vein. They're both great villains, but Bane being more of a mirror to Batman echoes how some of the greatest Bond villains, Bond perhaps being the film property that most inspired the Dark Knight trilogy, are often a mirror of Bond. The Dark Knight Rises is almost like Nolan's Bond film. Batman operates like an agent who will stop at nothing to accomplish his mission, and the whole way along will do it his way. There's even a relationship dynamic between Bane and Talia, from their shared experience in the pit to their twisted and pseudo-romantic bond that echoes Electra King and Renard in The World Is Not Enough. Even on a surface level, there are entire segments of the film, action set pieces, ripped right from Bond. The opening with the inverted jet is right out of License to Kill. Bane's plot to kidnap a scientist to achieve massive scale destruction in a direct attack against the hero's home base, Batman's Gotham to Bond's London, is ripped right from a mixture of Thunderball and GoldenEye. Tom Schoen also addresses this in the Nolan Variations. The prologue, in which Bane and his men ensnare a turboprop plane with a C-130 Hercules transport plane, is a classic bit of vehicle-on-vehicle abduction straight out of Bond, like the space shuttle that swallows another space shuttle in You Only Live Twice. But no Bond villain was ever as detailed when it comes to the fine print of his plan. Missiles are only the first step to prove our powers, says Dr. No, but what the next steps are after he's messed up the launch of the US space shuttle using an atomic radio beam are a blank. In a matter of hours, when America and Russia have annihilated each other, we shall see a new power rule the world, crows Ernst Stavro Blofeld in You Only Live Twice. But what the system of governments is to be, some capitalist-communist hybrid, perhaps, remains unspecified. In The Dark Knight Rises, we get blueprints, fine print, a plan for civic takeover detailed down to its last nut, bolt, and rivet. One of the most Bondian aspects of the film, though, is the ending. The idea of Batman going away and getting to live a normal life is the ending that James Bond wants, not typically what Batman wants. I know the ending can be controversial for a lot of people, but hear me out. The final 10 minutes or so of this film are perfect. More than that, they're really the only way this trilogy could have concluded. It's the fulfillment of Batman being a symbol of hope and justice rather than the vessel through which they're delivered. Batman is no longer Bruce Wayne, Batman is an idea. This allows Bruce to separate himself from the icon he created. Batman is no longer a person, Batman is a mantle. Batman becomes immortal. The characters, even Bruce, all watch Batman die, definitively. People get hung up on specifics like Cotillard's performance during Talia's death scene, or how there's no way Bruce could have ever escaped the jet before the explosion, but they ignore the intent in the process. Nolan deliberately manipulates time with the ending, creating a disorientation as we see this event play out from the POV of every important person in this trilogy. There are moments that are played from Blake's point of view, from Gordon's, of course from that of Bruce. But the POV switches almost from shot to shot. There's supposed to be confusion, obfuscation around this moment. Bruce arranged it as such. And for those of you who can't accept that, remember that Batman flat out tells Gordon and Catwoman that there's no autopilot, and then Lucius Fox's final scene spells the real truth out. Bruce engineered the autopilot to ensure that he could get out safely, and so he does. He's far away from that bomb when it actually goes off, and the explosion is so massive and probably too dangerous to ever go near that no one would ever be able to verify that his body was or wasn't there. But even beyond the logic of the scene, that dreaded word that is used so often as a dismissal for great drama, but it's especially frustrating here when the logic issues are based on falsehoods, even beyond the Bondian inspirations, is one of the most moving and captivating endings to a film ever. It begins with how Bruce tells Gordon who he really is. The way that Hans Zimmer composes this scene, using the same musical cue for Gordon's flashback that he did from the Batman Begins scene that it's lifted from, combines with Gary Oldman doing pitch-perfect work, create one of the defining moments of the entire trilogy. And in the wake of Batman's sacrifice, everyone gets the final note that they deserve. Alfred is given the space to mourn the person who matters most to him, before, in an immensely satisfying moment, being given the real closure he deserves, the ending for Bruce that he always wished for. Gordon is morose between Batman's sacrifice and an uncertainty about Gotham's future, but then he gets his reassurance in the form of a new bat signal. The silent understanding that Gotham will have a watchful protector once again, which brings us to Blake, because he is the character Nolan ends this entire story on. Throughout the film, Blake struggles with the corruption and injustice present in Gotham, and he can't take working for the system. He finds the manipulation of dense ghosts distasteful, especially upon seeing that Batman and Gordon only enacted change by lying and creating a police state. This motivates him to operate outside the lines, to work towards something better, more just. That's why he's the best possible successor to Bruce Wayne, and Bruce knew it. He knew Blake would rise to the challenge of continuing the legacy and making Gotham a better place. He knew he would find the cave and embrace his destiny, and that brings everything full circle. It leaves us in the same place that we were when Bruce Wayne returned to Gotham after his time with the League of Shadows, and while a poorly executed full circle moment might be a source of eye-rolling, this particular one is pitch perfect. Blake rises into the darkness, and Christopher Nolan closes off the greatest film trilogy with the greatest trilogy ending. And I guess that brings us back to, well, me. I was still a teenager when Christopher Nolan unleashed The Dark Knight Rises on the world. I was getting ready to go into my senior year of high school, actually. For more than a third of my life at that point, I watched the most intricate, captivating version of the Batman mythos ever to unfold on the big screen. I literally grew up with these movies. I saw Batman Begins with my dad in a theater and had my mind blown as I was introduced to the greatness of Christopher Nolan and that Batman could be cool. You could take him seriously, and that it was okay to like a character like that and fall in love with superhero cinema. And my overall love of cinema was not only shaped while, but was shaped because I was seeing Nolan at work with each subsequent entry. And that kind of emotional attachment can't be understated. It can't be ignored, and it's a part of me. So, do I have a bias? You bet I do. Is my overwhelmingly positive appraisal of all three of these films colored by that? Hell yeah, it is, but you know what? At the same time, after all of the times I have seen all three of these films, I think Nolan earned the love. I don't just think he stuck the landing with The Dark Knight Rises, I think he created a genuine masterpiece. From Batman Begins through to The Dark Knight and finally this ending, he built upon and bettered his own work with each subsequent entry. Nolan might think that The Dark Knight Rises is his most underrated film, but I'll go a step further. It's one of the most underappreciated films, period, especially considering what they did, the risks they took, making a sequel to what's largely considered to be the greatest comic book film of all time, and the ambitions and the chances they took along with it. There's so much unfounded hate that this film gets, especially for the bad logic of its ending, that I think is not only overstated, but borderline wrong. There's so much negativity directed at his film that is based in falsehoods, and even with that aside, I get that art is subjective. I do. And you're free to dislike this film all you want, just as I'm free to love this film to pieces. But I've seen The Dark Knight Rises dozens of times now, and it gets me right in the heart every time. And to me, I find it wonderfully difficult to imagine someone not being moved by it. So here's to Christopher Nolan. Here's to the perfect movie trilogy, and here's to the greatest example of one, the Dark Knight trilogy, and the finale that cemented it as such.